I want to tell you about the research project that was at the base of me developing this way of thinking about leadership, then talk a little bit about the findings, because those findings then inform two other projects that I will briefly tell you about. And then if we have time, tell you a little bit about where I'm going next. Right? And so it's a lot that I'm trying to do here, but let's see how we do with it. So the original project that started these was a part of a larger initiative from the Ford Foundation, where they wanted to support the leadership work that was happening in 92 social change organizations, and they had groups of 20 organizations over the course of 5 years in a supporting, in a leadership recognition program, and they asked us to be the research and documentation of that particular project. And so we had 92 organizations over the course of time, and we had 164 leaders who worked with us because we invited them to be researchers, co-researchers with us. These were social change organizations that were part of this program. So that means they were nonprofits, most of them, although a few didn't have 501c3, but had the full other characteristics and then had a financial sponsor. But the key characteristic of this is they were less interested in social services by themselves and more using social services and other core tasks to address the systemic problems that the community was facing. And they worked on trying to increase the power of the people who were experiencing the problem so that they would get involved in solving the problems themselves. Like Chekovich and Conrider say, social change organizations represent a grassroots response to systemic social problems. These were the types of organizations where I first got interested in studying leadership in that context. Poder is an example, just so that you have in your head something. So this is an organization in East Austin, and they lived in their little place with beautiful gardens and very nice, tight Latino community, Latino and indigenous community. And then the area started to become the dumping ground for a lot of large corporations. And at some point, kids had asthma, adults were getting cancer, and they decided to organize, and they created Poder and started to fight against this problem in the community. They were from the community, in the community, and their leaders were professional, but at the same time, they were members of the community. So it's those kinds of organizations. They're not mom and pop organizations. They're fully formed, but they're not social movement organizations like Acorn or some of those bigger ones. Well, Acorn is gone now, but they're kind of like they're in the middle, sometimes connected to larger social movements, sometimes just connected to their local problems. So with that in mind, we said, okay, if we're thinking about leadership as a collective achievement, as something that happens in a group, how do we research or operationalize this? We said, okay, let's ask about the way people do this work as they are trying to do social change. So this was our research question. In what ways the community is trying to make social change, engage in the work of leadership? Notice, we're talking about leadership work, not, we could have said, okay, let's find what are the characteristics of the 192 leaders and develop another survey and do that. But we really wanted to think about what's the collective side of this? How do people contribute for leadership to happen in these communities? Because they would document very well how successful they were as communities trying to do change. So for example, Poder was able to push an ordinance in the city that allowed or forced city, anybody who was going to do an economic development program to have to consult the community before doing so, right? So that's the kind of power that they actually ended up having. So with that in mind, then we went about, I can tell you more about the methods if we have time, but we did action research, participatory research, ethnographies, collaborative inquiry, and narrative inquiries, and put everything together, 9 years of intense work. And this is what we came up with. Of course, this is just like a little bit, right? So in these particular communities where scarcity is an important characteristic, scarcity, financial, material scarcity is key, right? Leadership is about figuring out how the community can use its strength to be able to see abundance when others see scarcity, then use that abundance and transform it into specific resources, financial, symbolic, cultural, political resources that don't necessarily require money behind them, and then use those resources to leverage power. Because it is power that they need to influence those others outside who have some capacity to change the conditions that they need to have changed. Right? So we basically created this social change leadership framework where we say these organizations have this worldview that we call grounded humanism, because it's very humanistic, but it's also very grounded in the realities of power. They start from a lived problem in the community, develop a vision of well-being, use that vision to develop their targets of outside change. This change is happening in the community, in the society. And then use this ground humanism to do strategic work that leverages the power that they need. And they leverage the power by creating collective capacity. And how do they create collective capacity? Well, through good management practices, through developing the type of organizational tasks that you need for the missions. If it's a social change mission, there are particular core tasks. If it was a hospital, it would be healing patients. If it was a university, it would be teaching graduating students. We'll talk a little bit about what their tasks are. And then we saw there were these leadership practices. We were looking for them. It's not like they surprised us, but we were looking, what is that extra work? Or is there any extra work that is done in the context of this? And so we started to talk with them about when you're doing leadership at your best, when you think things are happening the way you want them to happen, what's going on? Tell us stories about when that has happened. And through those stories, we did a lot of analysis and said there were these recurrent things that they kept going back over and over and over time that seemed to work very well for them to be able to achieve the social change goals that they had. And over time, these recurrent things became automatic. It was like, there was like fish in the water. They wouldn't see them, but when they talked about them, we started to see them. They're practices because they are recurrent over time and they represent the best solutions to the problems that the organization is facing as it's trying to do its goal. So we said, leadership happens when these organizations are able to reframe the discourse and change the assumptions about the problem that's going on. Leadership happens when they are able to bridge difference between different organizations and groups that they need together to be able to do the work because they can't do it by themselves. And leadership happens when they are able to tap the potential of the members of the community and use them to come in. And these are three of the many possible practices, but these were the ones that we found in that context.